The Christmas story with angels, shepherds, the stable, innkeeper, wise men, the Star of Bethlehem, it's been a significant part of, the West for the last 2,000 years. But for many people, I suspect, these stories of the Nativity are simply warm and fuzzy stories that have become so much a part of our popular culture that people don't even really think about them too much anymore. They don't really think about the importance of the story and what it will mean for us today. And yet the stories of the Nativity are still steeped in meaning and significance. They are, in fact, revelations or insights into the awesome reality of a God who is not only incredibly real, but a God who has put in place a plan from the beginning of creation to redeem humanity, who then put signs in the heavens to mark the stages of that plan, a God who went on to reveal that plan to his prophets, and finally a God who calls us, who calls you to respond to him to today. 2 weeks ago we looked at the story of the shepherds, but today I want to look in more detail at the story of the wise men. And it's a story that begins with the Roman Emperor Augustus decreeing a worldwide census of his domains so that he would know the exact resources of his empire, the people and its wealth, most likely for taxation purposes. I think John Key would have liked them. The decree required that everyone return to their ancestral homes. And for Joseph and Mary, this actually meant, as descendants of King David, that they had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. It's a journey of 125 kilometres, about an hour and a half in the car for you and I. But for a woman on a donkey in her 9 months of pregnancy, I don't think it was quite that easy for her. And as we know, they only just made it, with Mary giving birth either that first night or within a few days of their arrival in Bethlehem. The birth occurred in a hillside cave that had become a stable for the local inn. At some point following the birth, and we don't know exactly when, but we will be exploring this, the wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star rising in the east, and we have come to worship him." So who were the wise men? Who were the wise men? Matthew calls them Magi. And if we were to dig a little bit deeper, what we would discover is that the Magi were part of an upper court of a body known as the Magistane. It's a body like, I guess, the English Houses of Parliament. There were two groups, there were two houses. There were the wise ones, the Sophoi in the lower house, and in the upper house there were the Magi, or the great ones. They were part of the heritage or the history of the Parthian Empire, the earlier Persian Empire. And the Magi, or the great ones, were also the kingmakers of ancient Persia. And it was these Magi, the kingmakers of ancient Persia, who had come to visit Jesus. But they were more than just a group of political insiders as well. They were also astrologers and scientists who not only accurately recorded the movement of the stars and the planets, but who also believed that those same stars could indicate when moments of great significance were about to occur, like the birth of kings, the fulfillment of prophecy, and so on. It wasn't that they believed that the stars were gods or anything like that. They saw them as inanimate objects, but they felt that the alignment of the stars in particular positions and their rising or falling at different times actually could indicate events of importance in the world. And it would appear that a group of these Magi had travelled from Parthia to Jerusalem, a distance of about 1,000 kilometres. They were escorted by one of their cavalry units, most likely, and they came to Jerusalem, they came to Israel to acknowledge the birth of what they believed was the fulfillment of the prophecy of a Jewish king. And it was no wonder that King Herod was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. You would think possibly that they came to Jerusalem first because, well, a new Jewish king, probably a son of the Jewish current king. So they came first to Jerusalem. The only trouble was, and they probably did know this actually, Herod wasn't Jewish. He was Idumean. He wasn't actually Jewish. And he was also an extremely paranoid man. And he was also extremely vicious. One of the Roman emperors, I think it was Augustus, had said that it was better to be a dog than to be one of the sons of Herod. He'd actually assassinated several of his sons because he felt that they were a threat to his throne. So how do you think Herod is feeling when a group of Parthian kingmakers arrive at his doorstep with a small army or small armed force, saying that we have come to pay homage to the new Jewish king who has just been born? Think he'd be a little bit worried? A little bit threatened maybe? Possibly he might have reacted a little bit more strongly, but Jerusalem was a bit of a buffer state between Parthia and Rome. Whenever Rome and Parthia had met in battle, Parthia had won. Their cavalry units, the cataracts, were amazing. They were really good. They always beat the Romans in battle. Herod's own army, most of his forces were actually away fighting the Homodacian War. So he was in a bit of a peculiar position. So what he does is he calls in his scribes, teachers of the law and chief priests and so on, and says, where is this king meant to be born, this prophesied king? And really, to be honest, the scribes didn't need to go away. They knew the scriptures well. They went straight to Micah, that had been just read to us, and they said, in Bethlehem, sir. In Bethlehem, Epaphra, one whose origins are from of old, of ancient of days. That is where the Messiah, the king, future king, is to be born. And so Herod says to the wise men, it's in Bethlehem, which is only about 6 or 7 k's down the road. So off the wise men go. And Herod, of course, is worried. He's perplexed, he's worried, he's a little bit paranoid, and we know, of course, that he reacted very, very strongly to what they discovered. And there was the murder of the innocents of all children in the area around Bethlehem who were aged 2 years old and under. But the real question I want to look at this morning is, why did the Magi make such a trip in the first place? Why did they leave, Babylon, Persia? Why did they leave that area and come all the way over to Israel? There are several possible reasons. Firstly is the Hebrew prophet Daniel, who had been held in high regard in the Persian court. You probably know the story of Daniel, don't you? Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel was a young Jewish nobleman, and he had been captured when Babylon had taken the city of Jerusalem and been taken into captivity. He had been taken into the palace and he had been trained up in protocol within the court and educated as possibly a Magi himself. He was a person who rose under Darius to be the 3rd ruler in the land of Persia. He was a very significant figure and had risen to real prominence in that land. And in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, there is a prophecy that Daniel records, given to him by the angel. And it's a prophecy that predicts the future death of the coming Messiah. And it predicts the death incredibly specifically. In fact, the death was to occur exactly 483 years, 69 weeks of 7 years, after a decree to rebuild Jerusalem had gone forth. To quote from Daniel 9:25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moats, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be cut off, die. And when you delve a little deeper, what you discover that there was a decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And it was in fact issued by the Persian king Artaxerxes in 457 BC. Which, when you deduct the likely age of Jesus when he died, which the Magi felt to be around 35 or 30-ish, gives you a date of around 2 or 3 BC for the birth of the Messiah. And that is part of the reason why the Magi were coming to Judah at that time. But it wasn't the only reason. But that in itself is pretty amazing, isn't it? To have a prophecy that predicts accurately, specifically from the going forth of the decree, there shall be a specific amount of time, and then he shall be born and later die. There was also the fact that in Babylon there were many Jews who had chosen to remain behind rather than return to Jerusalem with Nehemiah and Ezra. And these Jews had established a strong presence in Babylon and in Persia, and they had great influence within the city and within the Magi in particular, bolstered by the prestige of Daniel. And that would have meant that there would have been a real familiarity with the Magi of the Messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, not just Daniel's one, but others as well. And that also would have contributed to the expectation of a royal and significant birth at that time. There was also a Mesopotamian prophet called Balaam, whom we meet in the book of Numbers. You probably remember the story. Balak, king of Moab, sees from one of the mountains, sees the tribes of Israel in the Exodus coming towards the land of Moab, and he's frightened. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of these Israelites coming, and he's frightened of them. So he gets the prophet Balaam to come, and he says, I want you to curse the people of Israel. So Balaam stands on the mountain, looks down over the people of Israel, and he blesses them instead. And 3 times when he's asked to curse, he blesses. And Balak is really upset about this, of course. And finally, Balaam says, I have one final prophecy for you, and it's a word direct from the Lord. And I want to read it to you from Numbers. It's actually from Numbers, chapter 24. Then he uttered this oracle, the oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of one whose eyes see clearly, the oracle of one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are open. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. It's clearly a prophecy pointing to the coming of the Messiah. And also finally, about the time when Jesus was born, there was in the world of that day in the ancient Near East a strange feeling of expectation. There was a pregnancy, a feeling of that times were ripe for something significant to occur. The Roman historian Suetonius, in his work on the life of Vespasian, wrote, there has spread over all the Orient an old and established belief that it was fated at this time for men coming from Judea to rule the world. And Tacitus tells of the same belief. There is a firm persuasion amongst us that at this very time the East was to grow powerful, and rulers coming from Judea were to acquire a universal empire. It's like there was something in the air. There was an expectation that things were about to happen, a growing awareness in the human spirit that something was afoot, an awakening quickened by the Spirit that things were about to unfold. And finally, one last one, Zoroaster. He was a pupil of Daniel, and he founded a religion that became the Persian religion. He incorporated much of these prophetic understandings from Daniel and others into a work called the Zend-Avesta, and in it, it was predicted that there would be born unto the Jews a king, Messiah, and that his coming would be heralded by a sign in the heavens in the constellation Virgo. Now, I think I might know what some of you are thinking, because I was thinking it. While we may struggle with the fact that non-Christian or non-Jewish sources may seem to be proclaiming the Messiah's birth, I think we need to understand that the human beings are spiritual beings with a capacity to connect with God, and that the Spirit of God is actually at work all over the world, reaching out to all people regardless of their religion or race or ethnicity or whatever, seeking to bring all people into a relationship with God. Constantly, as you look through the Old Testament and even in mission today, you will see stories of the way in which God has spoken to people in different settings, in different cultures, in different contexts, bringing them a word that mission partners were to come and share the gospel with them. Visions of Jesus have been prominent in Islamic settings. We've got Paul in Athens when he's speaking in the Areopagus. He's uses the writings of the Greek poets as evidence of an awareness of the true and living God, even amongst the pagans. We have Balaam himself, who is a pagan prophet in a sense, but who has an awareness of God. We've got Melchizedek, and on the list goes. God will seek to bring all people to himself, and there are times when God will give a revelation of himself to others around the world. But the next question that I want to ask is this: what was the star that appeared in the skies? Because it was in response to the star that the Magi travelled. What was the star that appeared in the skies of 3 and 2 BC? There are many possibilities. Some have suggested that it was a supernatural phenomenon, maybe the Shekinah glory of God, maybe like the pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the desert and the wilderness. Maybe it was a comet, maybe it was a meteor, maybe it was a supernova. But the timing of all of those astronomical phenomena and the length of time that they occurred for all preclude them as being possibilities. In fact, there is only one possibility that fits the data, and amazingly it's a possibility that fits the data incredibly precisely. As you read Matthew, it becomes apparent that the account requires for the star to rise, to move across a starry background, to go before the Magi towards Judea, to head westward, and then it is to pause over the birthplace of the child. And there is only one astronomical phenomena that meets that scenario. It's a class of objects that were known to the ancients as wandering stars, or to us today as planets, visible to the naked eye. When we examine the night sky with planets in mind, we actually find there is a series of amazing celestial events that begin to unfold around the time of 2 and 3 BC. And it begins on August the 1st, 3 BC, with a new rising of Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, known as the King planet, just as the sun is rising at dawn. And what is interesting is that this is the precise phrase that is used in Matthew. While many translations, and this is what was read to us today by Dory, use the phrase, "We saw his star in the east," the more correct translation of Ente Anatole is, "We saw his star at its rising." That is the more correct translation. And significantly, the Greek singular form of Anatole has retained a very specific astronomical meaning of a star that appears, because depending on the time of year it is, some stars will be below the horizon and then they will come above the horizon depending on the time of year. When Jupiter appeared at this time, it appeared in the morning, just as the sun actually, for the first time, as the sun actually arose on that day as well, and it was actually in a sense against the background of the sun, with the rays of the sun behind it, kind of like here's the sun and here's Jupiter right in front of it at the rising. So for the Magi, who for that particular event was an incredibly significant event astronomically, when they saw that happen, they would have thought to themselves, something is up. Something is up. This was the first sign. Then on the 14th of September, 3 BC, and the 17th of February and the 8th of May in 2 BC, Jupiter, which we know as the King planet, passes close to Regulus, the King's star, and the brightest star in the constellation Leo. And Leo, as we know, is the constellation of kings. And it was also closely associated by some with the Lion of Judah, with Israel. So this is beginning to look very interesting for the Magi astronomers. And I'll just show you a picture now. That is actually the remains of the ziggurat at Zippar, which was built in such a way as to align geographically, or with north and south kind of thing, so that they could observe the stars in a very particular way. And that is where the Institute of the Astronomers for the Magi would have been based, and where they would have done their observations. And for them it's beginning to look very interesting. The royal planet is approaching the royal star in the royal constellation that represents Israel. In addition, on the 14th of September, which was when the first time Jupiter passed by Regulus, it was not only close to Regulus, but the sun was in the constellation Virgo. A royal planet in conjunction with a royal star, while the sun is in the Virgin. Seems to be an awful lot of interesting things coming together here. The second sign, September the 14th, could possibly indicate either the conception or the birth of the prophesied future Jewish king. Then on June the 17th, 2 BC, Venus and Jupiter, the two brightest planets in the solar system, appear to collide. They actually come together in a conjunction that was so close that we haven't seen the likes of it since. They stood an incredible 1/50th of a degree apart, and it seemed like one object in the night sky. And after the sun and the moon, it would have been the brightest object they'd ever seen. And if in fact the earlier date of September represented not the birth but maybe the conception of Jesus, then it's interesting to note that June the 17th is exactly 9 months or 40 weeks after that time. Could that be the birth of Jesus, the 17th of June? Possibly. But then there are others who say because the shepherds were out in the fields at night and they would have only been in the fields in the spring and autumn landings, that it was probably more likely to have been September as the birth date of Christ. But that's not all. 2 months later, on August the 27th, there is a final major coming together or conjunction of the planets in Virgo. Jupiter, Mars, Mercury and Venus all come incredibly close together in a conjunction. And taken together, this whole sequence of events would have been of incredible significance to the Magi. And it was enough to persuade them that the prophecies of Daniel and Balaam and so on in the Old Testament prophets were now coming to pass. And now was the crucial time. Now was the moment. A Messiah had been born. And at this point, something even more amazing happened. As the planets began to drift apart from their conjunction, Jupiter begins to move towards the west. And this was the sign the Magi were waiting for. Jupiter, the key player in the Christmas star sequence, was leading them west towards Judea. And as Jupiter passed its zenith directly overhead of Zippar and began to move off towards Judea, at about mid-November, the Magi hopped on not their camels, they rode horses. They hopped on their horses and started to head off towards Judea. It takes them about 6 weeks to travel that distance. And Jupiter, the king planet, actually, as wandering planets do, travelled before them, heading towards Judea in the west. Every night it would have been in a different place, heading towards the west. 6 weeks later, as the Magi checked the pre-dawn sky sometime late in December, Jupiter, they would have seen, was on the meridian due south of Jerusalem. It would appear directly over Bethlehem, 65 degrees above the southern horizon. But by now, Jupiter had also reached its furthest point westward. It stopped, and it no longer moved west. And as we know, planets have what they call a retrograde movement. So it actually stopped, and at that point it would have paused for about a day, or seemed to be about a day, and then it would have actually started to come back towards the east again. But it actually stopped and stood over Bethlehem, exactly over Bethlehem, before it began its retrograde movement back towards the east. And incredibly, the day on which Jupiter stopped moving and paused directly in line of sight over Bethlehem, and you can check this if you want to go and get some of these stargazer programs off your computer and put it in and just wind the clock back to 2 BC. The day on which the star paused over Bethlehem was the 25th of December 2 BC. Find that amazing? I find that amazing. An incredible coincidence of astronomical events. And it also happened to be the Jewish Hanukkah, which is the season of giving presents out. Jupiter had led them to Judea, and in general to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which only lay 6 k's to the northwest. The bit that I'm confused about a little bit is I understand why they went to Jerusalem, maybe to check up with Herod the king and so on like that. The star is directly overhead at this point, and it's directly overhead, and Bethlehem's only 6 k's away. They know to go to Bethlehem because of the scribal tradition and the prophecy in Micah, so they go to Bethlehem. But I can imagine them, they're in Bethlehem. Which house? I'm not sure where's the star exactly underneath me, But of course they had the dates on which September the 14th, they knew that was the date at which Jupiter passed by the star Regulus. That could have been the birth or the conception, and they also had June the 17th. So it's just a simple matter. Any babies around here born on June the 17th or September the 14th? Or possibly, maybe, for that final stage of the journey, an angel led them the last few steps of the way. We don't know. Maybe the Shekinah glory that appeared when the angels appeared and sang to the shepherds 15 months earlier. Maybe that's what appeared and guided them last few k's of the way. Julian.
You have to suspect that an angel or two were involved. This is such an important event in Christianity.
Yeah, may well have been. Yep.
If you look at the Bible, this is an important event in Christianity. There's often angels around certain things.
Yeah.
So you have to suspect because of the story of the wise men who come down to different like that. And there's also
Could well have been an angel for the last few days, or maybe they just inquired and got dates of when the babies were born. But either way, what an amazing coincidence, not coincidence, but coincidence of celestial events with the birth of Jesus. God is not above using the night skies to herald his activities. We only have to read of the sun standing still for Moses in the battle, one of the battles. We hear of how the sun went back 14 degrees as a sign for Hezekiah when he was ill. We know of what was a possible lunar eclipse at the time of Jesus, at the death of Jesus. And we only have to read Matthew 24 of the end times to know about all the celestial events that are going to occur then, with the moon and the stars coming down and so on. But the question we have to ask is this: what does it mean for us today? Firstly, God cares for the fate of all humanity, and he has left signs and prophetic words among many people and cultures over the ages to bring them to himself. If you look into missions writings and so on, there is a lot of evidence that God has not made himself unknown to people around the world. As you look into those cultures, if you look into our own Māori culture, there is an understanding of God who is called Io Matua Kore, the God who has no parents, without beginning. Who is that God? It is none other than the Most High God. Even within our own Māori culture, there is an awareness of a God who goes beyond, Papatuanuku and so on. And in every culture around the world, as people have dug deep, they have discovered that God has left signs and evidence that points to himself. But the question is this, and what always remains important and up to the individual, is how will you respond to those signs? Will you be like Herod, who is angry, rejecting, afraid of losing power, afraid of letting God be God in his life and ultimately missing out on life itself? Or maybe you'll be like the scribes who told Herod where the child was to be born. They knew the Bible, they knew the truth, but they were indifferent to it. They were indifferent. They didn't allow the chance of allowing it to enter in and to change them. And to be honest, I think that's the position of many people in New Zealand today. There are a few people, increasingly more, who are anti-God and anti the church, but most are pretty indifferent. And there are some in the church who are indifferent as well. They've grown blasé or apathetic kind of thing. They don't just care enough to allow God the chance to touch them and to change them. To be a bit like what Lexia was, to be active in our faith, to find that you've got a situation going on in life, and to say, God, you can be a part of this. And actually ask God to become involved, and then to see God moving. Or maybe you're a bit like the Magi, who read the signs, and who are willing to invest much in order to acknowledge Jesus for who he really is. Which one are you? In Revelation 3:15 it says, I know your works, that you are neither cold or hot. How I wish that you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, indifferent, and neither cold or hot, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Which one are you?